Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
This is the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning. NBC reporters are standing by to bring you the latest invasion bulletins as they come off the wire. Stay tuned to WEAF, New York.
And let our hearts be stout to wait out the long travail, to bear sorrows that may come, to impart our courage unto our sons, wheresoever they may be. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in Thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Let not the keenness of our spirit ever be dulled. Let not the impacts of temporary events, of temporal matters of but fleeting moment, let not these deter us in our unconquerable purpose. With Thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.
And give them strength to gain, we pray the triumph. is Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians. In our audience, 1,000 servicemen and women and civilians join us singing one of the great war songs of all time, the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Watchfires of 100 circling camps, they have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence in the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on.
A bulletin, London. A naval officer just returned to Supreme Allied Headquarters from the French invasion beaches reports that all main points have been gained and that reinforcements are pouring across the Channel in an unprecedented stream. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
You'll be sure to get the latest invasion news if you keep tuned to WEAF. NBC will interrupt any and all programs for special bulletins. Keep listening to WEAF, New York.
Continuing NBC's coverage of the invasion news of D-Day, the following program will be interrupted without delay to bring you the latest invasion news. Keep tuned to this station.
Folks, this is Bob Hope speaking from a P-38 airfield out here near Van Nuys, California. We look forward to being with these men and doing our regular show here, but of course nobody feels like getting up and being funny on a night like this. But we did want to go through with our plans and visit with these fellas because these are the same kind of boys that are flying those 11,000 planes on our big effort. What's happened during these last few hours, not one of us will ever forget. How could you forget? You sat up all night by the radio and heard the bulletins, the flashes, the voices coming across from England, the commentators, the pilots returning from their greatest of all missions, newsboys yelling in the street, and it seemed that one world was ending and a new world beginning, that history was closing one book and opening a new one. And somehow we knew it had to be a better one. You sat there and dawn began to sneak in, and you thought of the hundreds of thousands of kids you'd seen in camps the past 2 or 3 years. The kids who scream and whistle when they hear a gag in a song. And now you could see all of them again in 4,000 ships in the English Channel, tumbling out of thousands of planes over Normandy and the occupied coast. In countless landing barges crashing the Nazi gate and going on through to do the job that's the job of all of us. The sun came up and you sat there looking at that huge black headline, that one great black word with the exclamation point, invasion. The one word that the whole world has waited for, that all of us have worked for. We knew we'd wake up one morning and have to meet it face to face. The word in which America's invested everything these 30 long months. The efforts of millions of Americans building planes and weapons. The shipyards and the men who took the stuff across. Little kids buying war stamps and housewives straining bacon grease. Farmers working around the clock. Millions of young men sweating it out in camps and fighting the battles that paved the way for that headline this morning. Now the investment must pay for this generation and all generations to come. And folks, what a wonderful thing it is that no matter the price, the reward will be greater than the sacrifice. We hope that thought can go along with a prayer tonight. The prayer of a whole nation. God bless those kids across the English Channel.
A maiden's prayer. Thou canst hear the from the wild. Thou canst save. Thou canst save amid safe may we sleep beneath thy care, though banished, outcast, and reliant. Maiden, hear a maiden's prayer. And mother, hear a suppliant child. Ave
Thank you, Francis Langford. Now here's a medley of our military tunes in a salute to all our forces. Thank you, Stan Kenton. Francis Langford is now going to sing an appropriate tune, Good Night, Wherever You Are. Take it, Francis.
Good night, wherever you are. May your dreams be pleasant dreams wherever you are. If only one little wish that I wish comes true, I know that the angels will watch over you. Good night, wherever you are. I'll be with you, dear, no matter how near or far. With all my heart, I pray everything is all right. Wherever you are, good night. Good night, wherever you are. I'll be with you, dear, no matter how near or far. With all my heart, I pray everything is all right. Wherever you are, good
Very nice, Francis. Here's Stan Kenton and his band playing I Know That You Know. Sure, Stan. Thank you very much, Stan Kenton. Ladies and gentlemen, we took a sort of a poll today to find out what number these boys here would like to hear. Of course, we had to change our format a little due to our of our regular show. And these P-38 pilots and the ground crewmen here at the Van Nuys Aerodrome would like to dedicate this next tune to their fellow airmen over there. And here we bring Jerry Colonna and Vera Vague under wraps tonight out to lead the Air Corps song. How about that, boys? Huh? Folks, it's old anxiety time with all of us here tonight. The last show of a season that's given us a lifetime of memories. We'd like to thank all the people who've given us those memories, but the list is longer than a roller towel. The top of the list are kids like these here at Van Nuys and in camps all over America. Right beside them are you folks out there in the homes these kids are fighting for. And I'd like to thank the swell gang who helped us hang this Tuesday night show together. Yes, sir. It's the last program of the season, and a couple of days ago maybe that would have seemed important to us. But General Eisenhower and America's finest open a new season with a new show that tops anything on earth. A new season for freedom and a show that's playing the four corners of the globe. And when that show is over, freedom's enemies will never open again. Let's all hope and work and pray that it may be a short, successful season. Folks, we'll be seeing you again next year, and the best of the best to you and your boys across the sea. Good night.
Tonight, the Bob Hope Show has come to you from the Metropolitan Airport, Van Nuys, California. Our host has been the 4th Air Force Command, Major General William E. Lynn, commanding. This is Wendell Niles speaking and returning you to our main studios in Hollywood.
This is the National Broadcasting Company. NBC again asks you to pause in prayer on this invasion day. Archbishop Samuel A. Stritch, Archbishop of Chicago, will lead us in prayer.
Merciful Father, look down this day with favor upon us. In unfeigned lowliness of soul, acknowledging our utter dependence on Thee, we beg Thy blessing on our mighty undertaking to end this war and to bring to all nations a peace pleasing to Thee. Our armies are engaged in a crucial struggle against a fierce, strong, resourceful, unconscionable enemy. Have mercy on us. Give us the constancy to fight courageously through all adversities unto victory. Make us strong in the dark days ahead and sober in all our success. Root out from our hearts all hatred and thought of vengeance, and fill us with the purpose of winning Thy favor and peace as we beg Thy merciful aid in battle. Grant eternal rest to our heroes who have died that we might live as freemen. Protect and prosper our soldiers and sailors. Unite us in honoring and serving Thee. These things we ask, Father of mercies, through Christ Thy Son, our Lord, one God, with Thee and the Holy Ghost, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We take you to New York.
The time is now, the time is now. It's time to eat the writing on the wall.
This is Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians, ready with more words and music which we hope will add inspiration and yet help to ease the tremendous tension we all are feeling. We've been told that our invasion of the European continent will be a long, hard ordeal, as wave after wave of our fighting men storm the beaches from which there can be no retreat. For those of us who can't be in the fight, there's no retreat either. At this moment, every hour of war work for which we are responsible is doubly important. Let's do it well. The need is great. The time is now.
Are you ready for the start? Is your heart in the fight for the right to defend to the end of the Lord? Will you meet the final test with the best at your hand for the land that we made with the aid of God above?
Now, a pair of companion songs. First, the song of the amphibious forces, We're Going In. Then a brand new one for all the boys, Sergeant Marvin Long's We're Coming Back. We're going in, we're coming back.
Let's go, we're going in. There's a beach out there in
American eyes and hearts tonight are turned beyond the blue horizon toward a new and happier day to come. The Glee Club and Gordon Goodman sing that fine old song of optimism, Beyond the Blue Horizon.
Beyond the blue horizon waits a beautiful day.
Goodbye to things that bore me.
Joy is
Waiting for me.
I see a new horizon.
My life has only begun. Beyond the blue horizon lies the rising sun.
Blow whistle, blow away the past. Go engine, anywhere, I don't care how far.
On from the darkness into dawn, from the rain into the rainbow, fly with me. Gone, gone, all my grief and woe, no matter where I go, if I'm free.
Beyond the blue horizon waits a beautiful day. Goodbye to things that bore me. The joy is waiting for me.
I see
A new horizon.
horizon.
Beyond the blue horizon.
My life has only begun.
Beyond the blue horizon lies the rising Beyond the blue horizon, the blue horizon. Blue, 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 blue.
Here now a new and stirring song for the man of destiny, the foot soldier of the infantry. We're on our way. Gordon Berger sings with the Glee Club.
Yard by yard, mile by mile,
The infantry's moving up. The infantry's moving in.
the infantry's moving on and on and on.
Yea, brother, verily, yea.
Hallelujah, we're on our way.
Wading through the water, climbing up a beach, slogging through the mud, choking in the dust. The infantry's moving up. The infantry's moving in. The infantry's moving on and on and on.
Yea, brother, verily, yea. Hallelujah, we're on our way.
There's a good time coming when we all get home, but you can't get home by giving in. So take all you're taking and give all you got. There's a good time coming when we win.
There's a good time coming when we all get home, but you can't get home by giving in. So take all you're taking and give all you got. There's a good time coming when we win.
Step by step,
Wading through the water,
foot by foot,
climbing up a beach,
yard by yard.
News has told the exploits of our gallant Navy. Join us, won't you, in a sincere prayer for our sailors, the Navy hymn.
Eternal Father, constant guide, whose arm hath found the restless tide, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea.
Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, is one of the songs of patriotism which has grown up with us and which we adults sing all too seldom. Here it is.
O Columbia, the gem of the ocean, the home of the brave and the free, the shrine of each patriot devotion, the world offers homage to thee. Thy mandate make heroes assemble,
Fred Waring. We are proud and happy to have taken part in this great radio tribute to our fighting men. From the Pennsylvanians, good luck and Godspeed to them all. Good night.
And they'll see a mighty show again, the curtain's going up, and you'll hear that call to give your all, and the time is now.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The entire facilities of NBC are geared to give you the latest invasion news. Bulletins will be broadcast as soon as they're received in the NBC newsroom. Stay tuned to WEIF, New York.
Continuing NBC's coverage of D-Day events, the following program will be interrupted without delay for any special invasion bulletins. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Marvin Miller speaking to you from Hollywood on Red Skelton's Farewell Show. Ozzie Nelson and his orchestra open the program with San Fernando Valley. Show, Red Skelton.
Thank you very much, Marv. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to offer a child's prayer on D-Day. The time is 7:30. The place, Junior's house all over the world today.
Junior, come on, it's time for bed. Did you wash your face and hands good?
Yes, I did. It's all nice, quick and fine, you know. Hey, Mummy, why is everybody so excited today, huh?
Well, 'cause this is D-Day.
Who's that?
D-Day?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you all about it on our way upstairs. Come on.
Okay, let me walk upstairs. I'm too big to be carried, you know.
No, you aren't. Little boys never get too big. Ooh. Besides, Mother wants to feel your little face against hers.
You know, that's the way Papa and you used to walk upstairs with his head on your shoulder, isn't it? Hmm?
Yes, darling.
Now, will he be back from the war soon, Mummy?
Yes, dear. Very soon now.
Hey, Mummy, what is D-Day? Do-It Day? Is that what that means?
No, darling. D-Day, that's the name given for the invasion.
Yeah, but what's the invasion?
The invasion?
Yeah.
Well, that's when your Uncle Jimmy and Uncle Guy and Uncle Tubbs and thousands of other little juniors, just like you, who've grown up just long enough to help free a world of hatred. Now, come on, say your prayers and then hop into bed.
Okay, but I don't just want to say the one about now I lay me down to sleep.
You don't?
No, I want to say me prayers tonight like you said yours, you know.
Well, all right. Wait till I light the little night candle.
Okay, like the little candle there.
Now, there you are.
Here, now, you kneel down beside me now. Kneel down. Now, and you fold your hands. Dear God, bless me, Mummy, and bless all me little buddies, Mummies, tonight. Let your angels protect all the little boys in the world.
and somehow let their mummies know that they're safe. Help them not worry. Even listen to the prayers from the hundreds of folks who took guns and supplies away from the little kid next door. Because they didn't realize they were sending the little boys out to fight without ammunition when they cashed in them war bonds. And bless the little boys and the girls who drive those hop-up cars that waste gasoline. Also, listen to the ones who don't share their cars with their neighbors, because they will from now on. And dear God, please help me grow up to be a real man so I can help build a nice, clean place for everyone to live in. And don't let me be prejudiced. Make me know that we are all your children, regardless of race, regardless of religion or nationality. Let me know that we is all one. Protect all the little boys in strange lands today and bring them back safely. Bring them back, dear God, with 2 feet so they can walk up to the gate, with 2 eyes so they can see the smiling faces on the ones that they left behind, and give them 2 arms so they can give their loved ones big bear hugs with. Bless mummies because of all their sons. Oh, and bless the man next door who didn't care if he got more than his share in the defense work he was doing, because he gets up early every morning at daylight and goes to work. And dear God, please bless President Roosevelt and all his buddies, Churchill and all of them, and help me be brave so I can protect me mummy while me pop's away. And now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord me soul to keep.
In bed you go. Cover up, my little buckaroo.
Amen.
As a lot of you know, Red is going in the Army tomorrow morning. That really means Clem and Willie Lump Lump and Bolivar Shagnasty and J. Newton Numbskull and Deadeye and Junior are all going in the Army, too. Oh, we're going to miss all of you, Red. And our sponsor, Mr. Hartnett, the rest of the cast, and myself extend our very best wishes in the greatest job in the world. And as a send-off, Ozzie and Harriet are going to sing What Do We Do in the Infantry?
What do you do in the infantry? You march, you march, you march. What do you do when your pack has got your back as stiff as starch? There's many a fall in the cavalry, but never a fallen arch. What do you do in the infantry? You march, you march, you march. What do you do in the infantry? You hike, you hike, you hike. What do you get in the infantry? A left and right oblique. The son of a gun in the signal corps is traveling on a bike. And what do you do in the infantry? You hike, you hike, you hike. The hard way, the hard way. Wet till you get there, the hard way. What do you do in the infantry? You win, you win, you win. What do you do for the victory? You move into Berlin. The rest of the army is riding, riding through a triumphal arch. And what do you do in the infantry? You march, march, march.
It's time for chow in the infantry. That was mess call just blew. Then you taste that GI coffee. Oh, what that stuff can do to you. Your only consolation is that the general drinks it too. But you walk it off in the infantry. You march, you march, you march. What do you do in the infantry on the day you get your dough? Well, first, if you want to keep your health, you pay off the guys you owe. Then somebody spreads a blanket out, and somebody says, let's go. So what do you do on payday? Row the hard way, the hard way. Gee, it's great when you make an 8 the hard way. What do you do in the infantry when you get a weekend pass? Well, you pick up a phone and you make a date with some babe with lots of class. You drive about halfway to town and the car runs out of gas. So what do you do in the infantry? Same thing, only it's on your own time. Yeah.
Ozzie and Harriet. And we've got a bit of a surprise here, ladies and gentlemen. They're walking over to the microphone. I didn't know they were coming in. Fibber McGee and Molly, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry, folks, but time
Hi,
is
Red.
up. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Around the clock and around the world, NBC reporters are standing by to bring you the latest invasion bulletins. Keep tuned to WEAF for up-to-the-minute coverage of the invasion. WEAF, New York.
Lead us in prayer. Let us pray. Most merciful God, our Father, whose patience is unwearied, and whose thoughts are high above our thoughts, we, thy needy children, this day cry out to thee in the midst of anguish, suffering, and conflict. Thou art our refuge and our hope. Forgive, O God, the sins of us all. Save us from becoming insensitive in a world of misery and suffering. Bless our valiant men on land, on sea, and in the air. Overarch and undergird them with thy love, this day and in all the demanding days to come. Search our hearts this hour, O God, and redeem them from all unworthy motives. Purge us as men and nations of self-interest. Then thou wilt be able to grant unto us patience and wisdom and hope. Then through the gospel of thy redeeming love, we may transform our lives and the lives of men and of nations until justice and righteousness and peace shall be established in all the earth. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
We take you now to New York.
Good evening. This is Robert St. John speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York and presenting a half-hour invasion program. During these next 30 minutes, we're going to try to take you directly to London, Rome, somewhere in Australia, Honolulu, and Washington for on-the-spot reports from NBC observers, men who have been at it for almost 24 hours without a stop, just as we have been here in the New York newsroom. Before we go abroad, let me give you the developments of the last few hours. First, there's a very roundabout report that Allied motorized troops have landed in Greece. This one looks very suspicious, but I'm passing it on to you for what it's worth. The report comes from London, which quotes a British news agency, which quotes the Turkish radio, which quotes Berlin radio. We do know that there's been considerable Allied air activity over Greece today. And now to the big news front, to France. The latest bulletin quotes an Allied naval officer just back from the beachheads who says that all the main objectives of the first day's campaign have been gained. He also says that Allied reinforcements are streaming across the channel, an unprecedented stream, he says. And here's a bulletin telling how the first Nazi prisoners have just begun to arrive at a British seaport. That must be a welcome sight for those English people who remember Dunkirk and how many of their men died or were captured on the beaches of France exactly 4 years ago. Earlier in the evening, a Free French radio station in Africa put out a story that General Eisenhower is now in France himself, that he's moved his headquarters across the Channel. But London has put that rumor to rest. London says the Supreme Allied Commander is directing the invasion from an advanced post in Britain. Berlin radio has just claimed that all the Allied airborne troops which were landed on the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey have been eliminated. But it's too early to believe an enemy report like that. Here's a bulletin about the war in the air. One of the greatest processions of fighter and bomber planes ever seen, flying off from Britain, crossed the Channel tonight to lend support to the men on the beachheads. Incidentally, the Germans are mighty jittery tonight, as well they might be. They expect that Eisenhower's men will make new landings before dawn streaks the sky of Europe again. They don't know just where those landings may come. They don't know whether they'll come in Norway or Holland or Belgium or somewhere else along the coast of France. And here's a bulletin which comes to us from a ship in the English Channel, an Allied ship. It says, the first ground troops to hit the beaches of France were Americans. Those American boys went ashore at 6:30 a.m. today. They were quickly followed by Canadians and by Britishers. Earlier, American and British paratroopers became the first Allied soldiers to set foot on the soil of France. They were in activity for about an hour or two before the ground forces landed. And now I think we have a report from London. Let's see. All right, to NBC in London.
This is W.W. Chaplin in London. It's still the tag end of D-Day in America. But over here, it's after 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning. The great day D is history. We're well into the day designated on the invasion calendar as D+1. And all available reports, Allied and Axis both, indicate that the invasion is being pressed on. Our men, airborne, our men in their tens of thousands are pressing forward, deep, miles into the French province of Normandy. We are told officially that the first hard hurdles have already been passed. The Germans say the battle is raging along a 19-mile front on the Cherbourg Peninsula. The new front, that long-awaited front on the western continent, has been established. It is quite evidently going to stay established. There is no report as yet of any major counterattack. Looking back now over these first crowded hours, it's easy to see that when the moment of decision came, General Eisenhower was greatly. You see, actually, the invasion was scheduled to begin a day early. General Eisenhower postponed it because of weather which might spell disaster. But further delay might have meant a complete reorganization, entire reshaping and retiming of the invasion schedule. So, there was the great call the horse off or go ahead just one day late, even though the weather was still far behind. General weighed that problem well. He took responsibility resting on his shoulders in those and he decided to go ahead. We know now that he chose well. Through sagging rain clouds, obscured and sometimes completely hidden, our planes began going out on a final pre-invasion bombardment. And in 6 hours, they'd flung 10,000 tons of fire-tight explosives on that internal coast of northern France. Meanwhile, the invasion fleet of some 4,000 vessels headed toward the continent. Naval ships of the line and Grand Armada moved in close to shore and turned their blazing batteries on the already heaving coast of France. The weather had improved. It was better than the day before, the day that Eisenhower thought unfit for D-Day. But there was still a heavy sea. And in some of the landings, fire from enemy store guns was ragged at best. And even that, more men hit the beaches, drenched from the stern. Some of them busy with seafaring, but all of them fighting men. Already the paratroopers had been landed back from the sea, landed by whole divisions.
We have just cut that London broadcast because, as you noticed, the reception was rather bad. Sorry we have to cut off our good friend Bill Chaplin. He had an interesting story there, but he'll be back. We'll get them again. Now, here are a few bulletins that have come in while Bill was talking through all that static and ether difficulty. Here's a bulletin that quotes a Canadian reporter with the invasion forces who sends us word that a Canadian invasion force won its beachhead over there in France in 2 hours and 45 minutes after landing and was well on its way to intermediate objectives by mid-morning today. And here's a bulletin. According to Swiss radio, Marshal Pétain has urged all Frenchmen to accept the measures which the occupying powers dictate. Now, that's a very mysterious story, because we can't tell whether Pétain means by the occupying forces the Allies or the Axis. Here's some odd little bits of color from the invasion front. Nearly every vehicle that was taken abroad for the invasion across the Channel had a name painted on it by its crew. One reporter said he saw jeeps which were named, which bore such names as Filthy Flora, or Axis Doom, or Adolf's Answer, or Dyspepsia, 10-shilling Annie, and there was one nicknamed for Ladies Only. The final mail delivery was made to the invasion troops as they waited on board the assault boats for the takeoff signal. The Army post office carriers in motor launches made the rounds of the invasion boats laden with mail pouches. On one ship, there was a soldier who was handed 50 letters just before he sailed off for France. Another boy got an air mail letter which had been posted in New York only 4 days before it was delivered to him over there in on the English Channel. In case you weren't tuned in about an hour ago, let me tell you that President Roosevelt, in his broadcast to the nation at 10 o'clock, said that the great Allied liberation assault on Europe has met with success thus far. The chief executive made this remark before asking all Americans to join him in prayer that the Allies may prevail over the enemy and build a sure peace. We've just learned that in addition to the USS Nevada, the battleships Texas and Arkansas also took part in the bombardment of the French coast last night and today. The British battleships Warspite, Nelson, and Romulus also were present, and the British cruisers Glasgow, Enterprise, Orion, and the Canadian destroyers Sioux and Algonquin, all of them very famous ships. We got this information from NBC's monitors, who picked it up from London radio. Incidentally, let me tell you a little bit about these NBC monitors. They're sitting right outside of this glassed-in studio from which I'm broadcasting. Half a dozen of them sitting there with earphones over their heads, listening, one of them to Berlin, one of them to London, listening to foreign radio stations all over the world. And from those stations, they often get very valuable pieces of information. Now, one of them has just come in and handed me some late dispatches that were picked up by the monitors from British radio. Here they are. The first German prisoners have been landed at British port, so I told you that. RAF pilots returning from low-level flights over France report that the Allied invasion forces appear to be doing very well, and that there's no longer any sign of opposition on the beaches. That is quoting British radio. From the air, said the British broadcast, it looks like a very orderly advance. The Allies have put up barrage balloons over the stretches of the French coast, which they have captured. Royal Air Force beach squadrons already have landed in France, taking supplies and plane fuel with them, the British radio reported. Well, now it's about time for us to go overseas again. We're going now to the Italian capital, that first liberated capital of German-held Europe. And so we take you to our NBC reporter, who is standing by right now, we hope, in Rome. Well, we seem to have a little bad luck tonight. We've been going pretty well today, starting with midnight last night when this story first broke. Right up until this evening, things were going pretty well with the airwaves. But I guess that bad weather they're having in the English Channel also is affecting our transmission. But that gives me a chance to do a little more talking here and tell you, here's a good story. I wonder if you've heard that each one of those American soldiers who went abroad took this list of things with him. He was given, as he stepped into his invasion barge by the Army, 7 sticks of chewing gum, 4 boxes of matches, a box of body insecticide powder, 3 boxes of K rations, 3 boxes of D rations, a pipe, some cigarettes, some chewing tobacco, some water purification tablets, a carton of cigarettes or the cigarette makings, 1 razor blade, a tin of canned heat, 12 seasickness pills, and 2 vomit bags. Those last 2 items, according to the stories we've had tonight, were used by most of the men. The water in the channel today was very, very rough. I have a little story about the weather in the channel here I better tell you about. But first, here's a bulletin that the young man beside me is very anxious that I read to you. We'll see why in just a minute. A late-night report from Supreme Allied Headquarters says that a strong wind blowing northwest is whipping up the waters of the channel and that the weather is showing no signs of moderating. But there will be no halt in the flow of Allied reinforcements to France. Well, now I understand why he wanted me to read it. It fitted right in with what I was saying. We were talking about the weather. That weather, incidentally, you know, caused a postponement of D-Day. D-Day was postponed for 24 hours because the weather suddenly turned bad. And then it seemed to clear up, and so the invasion was launched. And now it's turning bad again. That wind that I just told you about is blowing up great whitecaps in the Dover Strait, and high waves are sweeping the beaches. And there is no sign that the weather is going to improve in the next few hours. But now that we are in France, we can't stop. Now that we're in France, the reinforcements must go across. And they are going across because we've had a bulletin from England telling us that the ships on the channel form an unbroken stream, that an unprecedented wave, I think was the way one correspondent put it. Incidentally, a naval officer who's just back from the beaches said that the weather was worse, in his opinion, during this invasion than it was at the time of the Sicilian landings, the landings on down there in Sicily, in the Italian campaign. The weather was so bad that there was a great deal of seasickness among the troops. We've already learned that the casualties, thank God, have so far been very light. But there are a lot of minor casualties. A lot of the boys got bruised and banged up in those invasion craft as the large waves of the English Channel tossed the boats back and forth. Some of the boys got banged up quite a bit, and many of them were seasick. That crossing of the English Channel is a bad thing even at best. I remember crossing it just before the war started, just a couple of days before the start of the war, and it was pretty bad even then. Now, they seem to have a foreign point here.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, NBC takes you to Australia. The report comes to you by way of San Francisco. Go.
This is an excited country today. Crowds of people cluster around radios and at newsstands to talk invasion. Thousands of toasts of victory were raised in Sydney bars last night, even though liquor is scarce. Churches opened their doors for extraordinary services. All today, prayers are being said in nearly every church. All Catholic churches are celebrating special masses. A service is taking place in Sydney's largest synagogue at this moment. The news broke at dinner time last night, and I don't suppose a single Australian family talked of anything else at the table. Now it's just after lunch on Wednesday. It's a cold winter day, 42 above zero, and crowds are scudding back to work. Work that may be a bit slighted in the drama of the moment. And yet Sydney is not hysterical. Everybody has commented on the sober, prayerful way Australia has taken the news. That perennial barometer, the taxicab driver, had his say. One cabbie told me that this means the war in Europe may be over in a few months, and reverently he added, with God's blessing. But a Royal Australian Air Force officer said to me at breakfast this morning that the country expects many casualties. Plenty of Australian airmen are in Britain, and everybody dreads that cost of victory. The acting Prime Minister, Francis Ford, called this the greatest event of the war. Complete success, he said, will bring the defeat of Germany within measurable distance. Today's newspapers reflect Australia's feelings. The biggest paper, the Herald, said Australia and the world have waited for this day since Hitler drove into Russia. Australia will feel its deep kinship, the Herald added, with Britain and America and their allies. The newspaper said what all Australia is thinking. that as the fortunes of battle favor the Allied invasion armies, prospects in the Pacific will alter to our advantage. Australia knows that when Germany is defeated, and only then, can we throw our main weight against Japan. But Australia hopes and believes that this will not mean that our own Pacific offensive will be slighted. This country will always regard Germany not as a secondary, but as a less immediate enemy. And Australia is pledged to keep the food and raw materials moving to our bases in Europe. That's how Australia feels as her people fasten their coats against bitter winds, as they remember fondly what eggs for breakfast were like, and resolve to do with less butter and meat and tomato juice. They know they've a part in victory over Hitler, just as they so nobly fought for victory over Japan. Australia feels close to America and Britain today, and her people, 7 million of them, will support their allies with everything they have. There's hope, confidence, even exultation, and there are prayers that too many boys may not be sacrificed, that too many months will not go by before unconditional surrender. This is William Kelty speaking from Australia. We take you now to NBC in Honolulu.
This is Robert McCormick in Honolulu. Well, one aspect of the European invasion that interests us out here in the Central Pacific is what our troops will find when they penetrate more deeply into Hitler's Europe. What observers out here particularly want to know is how much damage has been done to Germany's industrial empire by our intensive bombings. Most of us have always taken it for granted that Japan will someday be subjected to the same terrific bombing attacks that we've been giving Germany. We've even thought perhaps Japan will take a worse beating from the air than Germany has, because by the time we can open up on the Jap mainland, we should have even more and even better bombers than we have now. The popular idea has been that Tokyo, well, indeed, most of Japan, will go up in smoke under heavy bombing. But some of our top military men out here do not agree. They think Japan's more important industrial areas are modern and extremely well built, and will be at least as hard to knock out as Germany's critical industries and defenses. But when we get into Germany, we can see how much damage our bombings have actually done, and then we'll be better able to tell what we can do to Japan. We've already had some good samples on a small scale of what bombing can do to the Japs. Our raids on the Jap islands and the Marshalls show we've hammered them into what borders on uselessness. In some ways, they've been even more thoroughly devastated than was Pantelleria, the little Mediterranean island that surrendered to Allied bombers. But these are far removed from the massive, widespread bombings we'll someday have to give the Jap mainland. The only true test of large-scale bombing has been in Germany, and we out here are very anxious to learn the results. Also, the fighting in Europe is an unprecedented test of large-scale amphibious operations. The 5th Amphibious Corps out here, the spearhead of the war against the Japs, is extraordinarily skillful in amphibious fighting. But they haven't yet tackled a job as big as that we're trying to do in France. The French invasion is much more nearly what we'll someday have to do on the coast of China or on the Jap mainland. Another possible wrinkle in the European invasion that intrigues us here is the question of what will happen to Japanese morale if we are spectacularly successful in France. It would leave Japan with the prospect of standing all by herself to face the greatest mass of fighting power the world has ever seen. She would face two of the greatest nations in the world, certainly, Britain and the United States, and possibly a third tremendous power, Russia. Surely not even Japan could fool herself for long about how such a lopsided fight would come out. And one other thing, the European attack is the climactic test of our troops in land fighting against the best the enemy has. And we're very interested to see how our troops stand up in the tightest pinch they've ever been in. This is Robert McCormick in Honolulu, switching you to NBC in Washington.
We take you now to NBC in Washington.
The President told the nation only a short time ago that the invasion has come to pass with success thus far. Then, in reverential tones, the Commander-in-Chief beseeched God to give strength and victory to our fighting forces. Well, Mr. Roosevelt's word that the invasion is a success thus far indicates the attitude of our high command here in the capital. So far, as Washington sees it, we have achieved our first objective. We have succeeded in making our landings on the continent of Europe. So far, so good. But from the military men to whom I've talked today, they say, let's wait for the fateful hour of decision which will come in about a week. By that time, the Nazis will have had time to assess our full power and our main striking positions. And then will come the real hour of crisis. The crisis not only for the Nazis, but for the Allied force of General Eisenhower as well. So by next Tuesday evening, a week from this historic D-Day, perhaps we will have another report from the Commander-in-Chief, a report expanding on his statement this evening that our invasion is a success thus far. Well, Mr. Roosevelt's prayer this evening reflects the spirit, as I find it, with which all of Washington is receiving the invasion news. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of our invading army, Admiral Ernest J. King, our Chief of Naval Operations, called at the White House today to make a personal report. And then Mr. Roosevelt, calm and serene, held his press and radio conference as usual. Well, virtually all of Washington's churches held special services throughout the day. At Washington's Episcopal Cathedral here, services were held every hour on the hour. And this evening, prayers for victory were said at St. Matthew's and at St. Patrick's. Well, but by and large, Washington, whose chief business is government, went about its occupation as usual today. Now, most of the work, of course, is connected with the war. Touching on the home front, a special House committee heard Sewell Avery, the chairman of Montgomery Ward, attack the seizure of his big mail-order plant in Chicago. But this evening, Mr. Avery received his answer from the government. The War Labor Board ordered Montgomery Ward to extend its controversial contract with the CIO union. Oh, in effect, the Labor Board is only inviting a repetition of this bitter feud between management and labor. And again, this evening, the State Department reveals that we won an important diplomatic victory immediately prior to our invasion of France. Acting Secretary of State Edward Stettinius tells us that neutral Portugal has agreed to stop all shipments of tungsten to Germany. So Hitler will have even less tungsten now to harden his steel for weapons. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation steps into the war news. J. Edgar Hoover, the head G-man, warns his organization that the invasion may bring an attempt at enemy sabotage on the home front. But even on D-Day, we can't get away from the fact that 1944 is a campaign year. Now, there were two special congressional elections today in New York City. A Democrat won one, and a Republican the other. The Republican victory came in a district which has gone Democratic for the past 25 years. But to me, the biggest invasion story in Washington today is one reported by my wife. She was shopping this afternoon in a big downtown department store. She was standing at a counter looking at ladies' blouses. Well, a middle-aged woman stepped up and asked the sales girl if she might see some blouses, too. The sales lady brought out several. But suddenly, this middle-aged woman put them down on the counter. "I'm sorry," she said, "but somehow I can't go on. You see, I have 3 sons fighting in France today." That was D-Day, June 6, 1944, in Washington. I return you now to Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York.
Well, I'm glad we got Washington and Honolulu for you, so our pickups aren't a complete failure. Here are several bulletins that have come in while Dick Harkness has been talking to you. The French beaches across which the Americans drove today were selected many months ago, we now learn. Only recently did the Germans seriously start to build up defenses there. And nevertheless, the attack found them far less heavily gunned and fortified than the great port areas in Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the rest of France. A German military spokesman is quoted tonight as saying that not even walls of burning oil could stop the waves of Allied attackers which stormed the bristling heart of the Atlantic Wall. That from a German. Tito's partisans are on the move tonight. They've opened an accelerated offensive in Yugoslavia to coincide with Allied landings in France. They have captured 6 towns from the Germans. As you may have heard before, today more than 150 soldiers, mostly Americans, were received by Pope Pius in a surprise audience. The soldiers had gathered before St. Peter's and had asked for an audience with the Pope, but they hadn't really expected to get it. By the way, be sure and keep tuned to your NBC radios for something very special immediately after this broadcast. Well, that's the news up to 11:30 p.m. Eastern Wartime, and this is Robert St. John saying good night.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The great offensive has begun. With NBC, Invasion News has the right-of-way over all programs. Bulletins will be broadcast as they come through. Keep listening to WEAF, New York.
New York Times this morning, a few hours before the landing began. This dispatch warned the American people not to expect too much of the French resistance movement. It pointed out the great difficulties under which the French must operate. The American decision to withhold full diplomatic recognition from General de Gaulle and the French committee is therefore being put to its first practical test. And if the resistance movement does not live up to the hopes that some of us have placed in it, there may be a temptation to blame that on General de Gaulle rather than on the French situation as a whole. If, however, the French resistance movement does prove effective, then General de Gaulle and his French committee will have scored a double triumph. They will have prevailed not only against the opposition of the Germans, but against the doubts and hesitations of President Roosevelt and our State Department. The people of the other occupied countries with their exile and their exile leaders will also follow events in France with passionate life and death interest. They'll see first how strong we are. Then they'll see how much authority an exiled leader carries. And if General de Gaulle cannot rally the French people around him with all his contacts in the French underground, then the exiled leaders of Belgium and Holland, and perhaps of Norway, too, may have reason to believe that from now on, the leaders of the resistance struggle will be found inside Europe and nowhere else. The Russians will also watch the course of the invasion with just as much interest as we're watching it over here, perhaps even with more interest, and this is why. Ever since the Germans invaded their country nearly 3 years ago, the Russians have been clamoring for a second front in the West. During these 3 years, they've had about 1/3 of their richest territories invaded and laid waste. Nearly 1/3 of the Russian people have been enslaved at one time or another by the Germans. For 3 years, the Russians have been living for this day of liberation because they've always believed that only large-scale military operations in the West can take enough German divisions off their necks for them to be able to hit back with decisive strength and really smash the German war machine. This Russian demand for a second front in the West is impossible to reconcile with the fears that some people have that Russia hopes and plans to dominate the whole European continent. Quite the opposite. Only by large-scale military operations in the West can the Anglo-American powers hope to exercise political influence over Western Europe, and the Russians are realistic enough to understand this. They'll gladly exchange a little loss of their influence, whatever it may be, in Western Europe for military assistance from us in their task of beating the main body of the German army, which, remember, is still drawn up on the Eastern Front. If today is a bright day for the Russians, it's a dark day for the Germans. The last German hope of making a separate peace with the Russians on the one hand or the Anglo-Americans on the other has now gone up the spout. Both the Russians and the Anglo-American powers are now far too deeply committed to their present strategy. They have too much to win by keeping it up, too much to lose by abandoning it. Nevertheless, we can expect to hear plenty of German propaganda that will continue to try to stir up suspicion and division between the Anglo-Americans and the Russians. The Germans are now under pressure from east, south, and west. They have a three-front war on their hands, and they'll fight this war with political as well as military weapons in the hope that somehow, somewhere, one of these offensives can be called off. And the Japanese are going to watch with deep concern what's happening in Europe right now. If the Anglo-Soviet-American coalition comes through its present test in Europe, then the Japanese will have good reason to fear trouble for themselves later in Asia. But any split between the Anglo-Americans and the Russians would redound only to the benefit of Japan. That's why the combined liberation of Europe means bad news for Tokyo. Finally, there's the American aspect of today's great happenings. The United States now stands at the peak of its military, of its economic, of its political, and of its moral power in the world. Never in the history of our country has our power of every sort, counted for so much as it does today. More than 150 years of American history lie behind the unexampled effort that this country is now making all over the world, not only in Western Europe, but in Italy, in the South Pacific, in Asia, on the seaways and skyways of the world, and right here at home in our factories and on our farms. We're throwing everything we've got this summer into the greatest military operation of all time. But it's much more than a military operation. The fate of the whole world is involved, and in that fate, the United States has the decisive role to play.
You have just heard Quincy Howe, Columbia's news analyst. Keep tuned to your Columbia station for a return to CBS World News Headquarters in just 30 seconds. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Now, here in New York is Columbia's correspondent, John Daly.
The latest news we have of the Allied invasion of northwestern France is still in that bulletin from the Associated Press in London, which reports that Prime Minister Churchill said tonight that Allied troops had penetrated in some cases several miles inland after effective landings on the French coast on a broad front. In Washington, President Roosevelt's top military, naval, and air chieftains reported to him that the massive Allied cross-channel assault is going well up to now. The invasion is doing all right so far, Admiral Ernest J. King, the commander-in-chief of our Navy, said as he left the White House after an hour-and-a-half conference with the chief executive. Into our studios and our newsroom here in New York have come a series of eyewitness dispatches from the other side of the world where the fighting is going on. We'll read some of these dispatches to you to give you a clear picture of what is happening as the Allied troops storm the fortress of Hitler. Correspondent E.V. Roberts, representing the combined American press, has sent, for instance, a dispatch telling how General Eisenhower spent the hours just before our men went ashore in France. General Eisenhower, he said, stood on a rooftop on Invasion Eve and watched a mighty airborne armada form in the sky and wing its way toward France and the beginning of the final phase of the War of Liberation. The Supreme Commander radiated a calm confidence contagious to those about him. He spent the greater part of the day among the troops, seaborne and airborne, walking from group to group, chatting and laughing with the men. At 2:30 p.m., says Roberts, on Monday, Eisenhower met with a small group of British and American press and radio representatives. He told them that the invasion of Europe would be launched Tuesday, and the machinery was already in motion. They were informed that the operation would be the largest of its type ever launched, and that the Allies had assembled their mightiest land, sea, and air force for the purpose. Eisenhower talked to them for an hour and a half. The conference took place in his command tent, a plain, bare-walled structure about 20 feet square with canvas roof and walls of stained pine boards. At the start, he greeted each correspondent with a handshake and a friendly, lopsided grin. He stressed the importance of the job his staff officers, British and American, had done in preparing and launching the blow, and spoke earnestly of his desire to emphasize this. The weather, the correspondents learned, had been the biggest Allied headache in the selection of D-Day. At one time, General Eisenhower interrupted his discourse to look out of the door and comment with enthusiasm upon a patch of sunshine. The general sat comfortably slouched behind his big, battered desk. On the desk top was a green telephone, a desk lamp, an inkwell, and a packet of cigarettes. During the conference, he occasionally leaned forward to tap with a finger for emphasis. He smoked constantly, sometimes lighting one cigarette from another. Beyond that, he made no movement. He did not appear to notice the express train roar of constant Allied air patrols overhead. Roberts adds that after the conference, the general stood outside, hatless and with hands in pockets, and chatted with the reporters informally. They remarked upon his calmness, and one asked him, "Don't these things make you nervous?" He chuckled and said he was the type that boiled up inside, but that when things got too bad, he was usually able to sleep it off. He told them that he planned to visit the airborne units during the evening, and that before turning in, he would probably read a little philosophy or a Wild West story. The correspondents were then permitted to tag along on the Supreme Commander's visit to the airborne units, but only with the understanding that they would remain definitely in the background. There is a warm, personal relationship between General Eisenhower and his men, and he made it clear that he wished it to remain personal. Roberts says that as the party swept along a road overlooking a coastal town en route to the airborne bases, the correspondents could see a great flotilla of landing craft out at sea. At the airborne assembly areas, Eisenhower walked swiftly and alone through the groups of men where they were drawn up at attention. He asked that they be placed at ease. He stopped frequently, picking men at random to talk with. Often he was completely surrounded by the men, and they trooped after him, laughing and joking like schoolboys. The reporters estimate that during the evening hours, he talked with several hundred men individually. He asked them where they were from. He seemed determined to find a paratrooper from his home state of Kansas, and what they did in civilian life and what their army job was. And then he added personal touches. He asked a youngster where he got his hair cut, and an ex-Dakota farmer how much wheat he grew per acre. He asked about the weird war paint of the paratroopers and was told that it was a mixture of cocoa and cottonseed oil. It tastes good, one trooper told him. The Supreme Commander's party reached the last base just at takeoff, says Roberts. At 7-second intervals, the big C-47s roared off the runway and lurched into the sky in a seeming endless stream. Eisenhower was escorted to the roof of headquarters for a better view as they circled above, coming into formation for the great task ahead. He turned his face toward France and watched them vanish in the darkening sky. And that's how General Eisenhower spent the last hours before invasion. The British radio has just reported that every plane in the vast fleet of American transport aircraft that flew with troops and equipment onto the continent was painted with broad blue and white stripes and carried colored lights, yet no fighters or heavy flak opposed it. The huge, brilliantly lighted armada stretched for more than 250 miles, continued the broadcast, which was recorded here at the CBS shortwave listening station. It traveled only a few hundred feet above the ground, and it took more than an hour to pass. It met only small arms fire, mostly from 50-caliber machine guns. Here is a late bulletin with a dateline Folkestone, England on it. It says, German guns across the English Channel opened fire at 5 p.m. today for the second time since the invasion began, but ceased as soon as Royal Air Force planes appeared over them. That is, of course, 5 p.m. English time, which would be 11 a.m. New York time. Penetrations several miles inland were made by American, British, and Canadian troops which poured into northern France by air and sea in overwhelming strength and established firm fighting fronts in the first stage of the battle for Europe. That is, in essence, a summary of what Prime Minister Churchill said in his report to the Commons. Mr. Churchill, in his second appearance of the day before the House of Commons, gave this stirring report of the invasion. The Supreme Headquarters of General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Allied Expeditionary Forces added to Churchill's summary by disclosing that the first in a series of 4 or 5 obstacles in the way of Europe's liberation has now been overcome, disclosing that enemy opposition was less than anticipated and that coastal defenses were weakened into virtual uselessness by air and naval bombardment. Churchill said our airborne troops are well established and our follow-ups are all proceeding with very much less loss than we expected. Fighting, he said, is proceeding at various points. We have captured various bridges which are of importance and which are not blown up. There even is fighting proceeding in the town of Caen. That's spelled C-A-E-N, of course. All of this, although very valuable, is a first and vitally essential step, but it gives no indication whatever of what may be the course of the battle in the next few days or weeks, because the enemy will not probably endeavor to concentrate in this area. Here is more detail on the American leader's report to President Roosevelt. Admiral King, you'll remember, came out of the White House a little while ago and seemed to be very happy about the progress of the invasion. Admiral King was at the D-Day conference with the President, together with General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, and General Henry H. Arnold, the Chief of the United States Army Air Forces. The 3 top-flight leaders of America's military might emerged from their conference with President Roosevelt smiling and in apparent good humor. General Marshall was asked if he could say anything about the progress of the Allied landings, and he replied, "I'd rather not," but he smiled with evident satisfaction. Admiral King then said, "It's doing all right so far." President Roosevelt called the officers to the White House a few hours before, and he will go on the radio to lead the American people in prayer for success of the Allied liberation of Europe. Now, evidently, the airborne troops, which would mean paratroopers, glider-borne troops, and transport troops, have played a very major part in the securing of beachheads in Hitler's Europe. And here, a United Press correspondent who has just returned to England after riding on a 9th Air Force troop carrier plane, which dropped American paratroopers on France, tells his story. It's an eyewitness description. He says American parachute infantry, spilling from troop carrier planes with deadly stealth, apparently caught German defenses by surprise before dawn and struck the first American blow at selected targets in Normandy. Thousands of paratroopers were dropped dead on targets by hundreds of Dakota carrier planes operating in 3 wings from myriad bases in Britain. The surprise, he says, was shown in the lack of opposition to the first plane arriving over the drop zone and the moderate and inaccurate flak encountered by those which followed. Night fighter opposition was negligible, although the big C-47s and C-53s, which carried up to 18 men each, were escorted by Allied night fighters and intruders. The huge planes roared off from their bases in the dead of night, and a few hours later returned with one of the lightest casualty lists ever reported for an operation of such magnitude. The weather favored the paratroopers. The planes were able to drop below an undercast directly over the drop spots. And while the American paratroopers hit at German communications, airfields, supply dumps, and command points, British airborne units were striking farther along the French coast. Brigadier General Paul L. Williams, whose troop carriers led the invasion of Sicily, congratulated all wings in his command on the successful execution of their missions. Few crews reported difficulties. Lieutenant Arthur T. Douglas of New Orleans, who brought his Dakota over the drop zone in one of the later groups, encountered heavy ground fire, which made it impossible to drop his paratroopers on the first run. He made 3 runs in all before dropping his human cargo. When we approached the drop zone, Douglas said, it appeared circled with machine gun fire and light flak which formed a crossfire. The bullets sounded like rain on a tin roof. We made 1 run, but nobody could jump. And as I started away from the target, the crew chief told me about it. We were going out over the channel, but I swung the plane around and went back over the drop zone again, trying to get under the trajectory of ground fire. That time, most of the men jumped, but there still were some unable to get away. Flak burst near us and threw 3 men to the floor, so we circled and went back a 3rd time. Bullets were whizzing all around the plane and cutting it up, so when I got rid of my stick, I went to the deck and got out of range. When he says he went to the deck, of course it means he went right down as close to the ground as he could get. Major Howard W. Cannon of St. George, Utah, who was co-pilot of the lead plane, said that his crew saw fires burning furiously near the drop zone, apparently started by preparatory bombings. They looked like barrels of oil going up, is the way Major Cannon described it. His plane encountered some gunfire going over the Channel Islands, but it was ineffective, he said. Lieutenant Jack H. Smith of Hot Springs, Arkansas, saw 1 transport shot down. He says that we had passed the drop zone when we saw a blue pulsating flash from the plane ahead of us. We followed the burning flyer down. He went down gamely. But before he hit the drink, we saw 5 parachutes blossom out of the plane. That was the report of a United Press correspondent who went over Europe with American parachute troops this morning when the invasion started. America, here at home, we seem to have received the news of the invasion of Europe very calmly and then turned to the altars of our faiths to pray for peace with victory. In the nation's hamlets and in the great cities, people went to churches, temples, and synagogues to meditate and to participate in the services of prayer scheduled for D-Day. There were few demonstrations. Groups gathered at newsstands and stood before radio loudspeakers. Comment generally reflected the combination of hope and trepidation which marked the end of a tense waiting period. I'd just come up to New York from Washington, and on the way up I noticed in the railroad stations that the people stood very quietly and read their newspapers. Even here in New York, in the subways, instead of glancing at the front page and then running to the sports page, people were sitting quietly and reading the latest details of the invasion from their papers, and sometimes on the stations you saw them portable radio, which was giving the latest news as they stood there. The people have been quiet. Perhaps they've tasted so often of this invasion that they now understand that just securing a beachhead doesn't mean the battle is won. They know that the days ahead of us are going to be just as difficult as those hours which followed immediately after H hour on D-Day, which is today. Thousands of men and women in war production plants observed a brief moment of silence, followed by an immediate resumption of the flow of materials of war. Plant officials announced uniformly and proudly that the announcement came without a slackening of output. Here in New York, a public prayer observance to be held at 5:30 p.m. this afternoon at the Madison Square Eternal Light World War I Memorial was announced, in ceremonies which will be repeated in communities in all parts of the country. Some cities, such as Albuquerque, New Mexico, announced D-Day and H hour with sirens and whistles, summoning men and women to their places of worship. At the United States Veterans Hospital here in New York, 1,800 men, still hospitalized 25 years after World War I, were given the news by nurses. Patients in pajamas and bathrobes, walking on crutches and canes, gathered in the hospital lawns and bowed in silent prayer. Newspapers issued extras all over the country, and radio broadcasting companies, such as our CBS, pushed all scheduled programs aside to bring you the news. The New York Stock Exchange halted its activities for a 2-minute prayer period. Emergency orders for augmented personnel went out from the nation's telephone companies. As American servicemen accepted the news in their stride, a light note was struck by a group of French sailors in New York who linked arms and joyously danced down Broadway. That also happened in Philadelphia. I brought a new Philadelphia paper up with me, and they described there French sailors munching donuts in the Salvation Army canteen in City Hall Plaza, looking up when the women volunteer told them that paratroopers were landing in France. She had no way of knowing what the sailors thought, but she did notice that they gulped their coffee and swung across the plaza toward a subway entrance and their ships. The major racetracks suspended their programs, but generally sports events went on as scheduled. Virginia's civilian defense officials sent over the civilian air raid warning system a summons to 8 p.m. prayer meetings in all the cities and most of the towns. Here in New York, Lord & Taylor, a specialty shop, closed for the day, and its 3,000 employees were given the day off to pray and hope for victory. Now we have a bulletin here from New York which gives us further details on the young British girl, Joan Ellis, who sent through the false flash 3 days ago announcing the opening of the European invasion. Joan Ellis, it says, the 22-year-old British teletype operator who sent that false flash 3 days ago, reporting the European invasion, was very happily remembered by newspaper editors when D-Day finally arrived. The newsmen here found time to message expressions of agreement with James P. Rosemond, who was the managing editor of the Akron, Ohio Beacon Journal. He said, based on Joan Ellis's statement, asking America to forgive me, suggest AP editors cable message to her. Ours would be, no one in Ohio concerned about invasion flash, good luck and carry on. That message was forwarded to the London Bureau of the Associated Press. Tell the British girl who flashed the invasion Saturday that we all love her and that she scooped the world, said the Mayfield, Kentucky messenger. The South Bend, Indiana Tribune messaged, please cable Joan Ellis that Indiana thinks you knew it all the time. Comments such as these came from all parts of the country, and perhaps Joan Ellis did a great good deed for her country, for we know now that great fleets loaded down with troops and having all the semblance of a full-blown invasion have sailed repeatedly up and down the coast of France. They've had the Germans in tenterhooks and time again sent them to their bastions of defense only to find it was a false alarm. General Eisenhower this time played another one of his wonderful tricks on the enemy. Watching past performances of invasions, I saw some of them in the Mediterranean myself. They got used to the idea that General Eisenhower never invaded unless the moon was waxing, was new, that the tides were high, and the H hour always came between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning. This time, General Eisenhower let the moon go its way, let the tides pretty much go their way, and struck in daylight, probably accounting for the surprise of the Germans. Here is a late report from the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in England. More than 10,000 tons of explosives, it says, were showered on invasion coastal targets by an estimated 31,000 airmen in the 8-hour period between midnight yesterday and 8 a.m. today. Spearheading the tremendous aerial armadas which by night and day blasted apart for the invading ground forces was a giant formation of well over 1,000 RAF Lancaster and Halifax bombers, which last night dropped 5,600 or more American tons of bombs on 10 Nazi gun batteries. Remember that the Lancaster and the Halifax are the great British bombers which have roared out over Germany these 2 or 3 years past and can carry great loads. They are the planes that usually drop the great blockbusters weighing 8,000 pounds and even 12,000 pounds. The resistance of the batteries, that's enemy batteries, has been greatly weakened by the bombing of the Air Force, and the superior bombardment of our ships quickly reduced the fire of these batteries to dimensions which did not affect the problem. That is what headquarters announced, giving us one of the clear-cut indications of the reasons for the success of our initial efforts in the liberation of Europe. The estimate of 31,000 airmen in action, made by well-informed observers, did not include airborne troops. Now, the well-informed observer in England is undoubtedly a capable Army officer who is giving on-the-record background to guide the correspondents in their reports. We find now that the Japanese people have at last been informed of the Allied invasion of northern France. Don Mosley, our correspondent, the CBS correspondent in San Francisco, reports that Radio Tokyo has declined to editorialize in any manner concerning the success or failure of the operation. However, not a single Japanese comment has reached the Nipponese people themselves, and all Radio Tokyo remarks have been almost verbatim reports of German communiques. Apparently, the Japs are playing it very cautious this morning, paying lip service to their Nazi comrades, but avoiding any firm propaganda line lest they find themselves out on a mighty weak limb. Meantime, a Mr. Ushiba, former secretary of the Japanese embassy in Berlin, said, "It is not only the German High Command, but also the entire German people on the home front who have been itching for this moment, because their conviction is that the enemy's European invasion is the long-awaited signal to touch off the pent-up strength of the German Wehrmacht to deal a most decisive blow to the enemy." Then Ushiba in a sweeping remark, added his conclusion that now the Allies are walking into a death trap laid by the German High Command. However, such a comment has not been told the Japs themselves. That gives us a fundamental idea of the kind of Japanese propaganda that is going out to the people of Japan. I don't think that these reports from Japan necessarily indicate that the Japanese have any faith in the ability of their Axis comrades to hold the Hitler fortress of Europe. They must appreciate already that the beaches are secured. Here is a flash from Reuters in London, which says many secret weapons were used for the first time by the liberating armies in the invasion of northwestern France this morning. The Ministry of Supply in London revealed that information just a short while ago. We've heard in the past months, almost now for in the past 2 years, the reports of German secret weapons. We've had a good deal of information about their rockets, about their glider bombs and their radio-controlled tanks, but we've had very little on the Allied side in the way of boasting of our magnificent weapons. I saw some of them in operation at the Anzio beachhead. They can't be talked about even now, and yet even those weapons, as terrible as I saw them, have been superseded by even newer weapons, since this report says that many of the secret weapons were used for the first time by the liberating armies when they broke their way into northwestern France this morning to start the long-awaited liberation of the occupied countries in Europe. The news continues to come into the CBS newsroom. We will be standing by here to give you the latest reports as they come in. The latest report we have so far on the progress of the fighting is the announcement from Prime Minister Churchill that there have been penetrations of several miles. Radio France in Algiers broadcasts a statement by André Le Troquer, who is the French Commissioner for the Administration of Liberated Territories in metropolitan France, declaring that the liberation of France has started. Following is the text of the statement as broadcast to French areas and reported by the Federal Communications Commission. Events expected by the whole of the French people have finally taken place, says Mr. Le Troquer. Our hope becomes a reality. The liberation of France has started. In this most solemn hour of our history, we all have only one duty, total sacrifice for the motherland. French blood will flow again. Think of the sufferings that our brothers will have to endure to be finally liberated. Let us unite all our thoughts in the certainty that tomorrow France will be free and we shall make her greater and more beautiful than she has ever been. That report came from Algiers, the seat of the French Committee of National Liberation, and was made by André Le Troquer, the French Commissioner for the Administration of Liberated Territories in metropolitan France. Meanwhile, we received earlier today the news from London that General de Gaulle has arrived in England and evidently has already held consultations with the British authorities, looking for the complete cooperation of the people inside France. What we can expect in the way of cooperation and help from the French people must still remain a question mark. We do know that there are Frenchmen who have fought against the Germans underground for many, many months, for many years inside France. We will only have to wait now for time to see if all France rises to help us, and we feel sure that they will. These reports that we have just read you, eyewitness reports, and the last-minute details of the news of the invasion have just come into our newsroom and constitute the latest information that we have.
You have just heard CBS correspondent John Daly. And now, while we wait for more news on the invasion, we will present another program. Our Gal Sunday, presented by the makers of Anison, Life Can Be Beautiful, presented by the makers of Ivory Soap, and Ma Perkins, presented by the makers of Oxidor, will not broadcast today because of the special news you've just heard. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Crisco's radio newspaper with Bernardine Flynn, brought to you by the makers of Crisco. And now, here's Bernardine Flynn.
Thank you, Ed, and hello, everyone. This is the day for which we've all been waiting. D-Day, invasion of Western Europe. To millions of people in the occupied countries, this is the beginning of their liberation, after many long years of domination by Hitler and the Axis. Of course, we all want to hear the latest details, and in order that we might bring you as much invasion news as possible, Crisco is dropping its usual commercial time. Now let's switch to the New York headquarters of CBS World News for a report by Alan Jackson, one of Columbia's news editors.
Briefly, the situation at the moment is this. We have landed, and from all indications have things well in hand.
Most of the details as to exactly what's going on come from the Germans, because, naturally, our commanders are going to use utmost caution in releasing information which the enemy might not have. However, Admiral Ernest King, the commander of the United States fleet, said this morning in Washington after a conference with President Roosevelt that, from his viewpoint, the invasion of Europe is doing all right so far. The grand assault on the continent, as a matter of fact, was scheduled for yesterday, but it was postponed until today because of bad weather. When it did get underway early this morning, shortly after midnight, it found the highly vaunted German defenses much less formidable in every department than had been feared. For instance, airborne troops who led the assault before daylight on a history-making scale suffered extremely small losses in the air, even though the great plane fleets extended across 200 miles of sky and used navigation lights to keep formation. Naval losses for the seaborne forces are described as very, very small, although 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft took part in transporting the American, Canadian, and British troops to France. Coastal batteries were virtually silenced by the guns of the British, American, and Allied fleets, including battleships, and the beachheads were speedily consolidated. The German radio says the scene of the landings was a 100-mile stretch of the coast from Cherbourg to Le Havre. Britain's Prime Minister Churchill, announcing the successful invasion of the House of Commons at noon, 6 hours after the first seaborne troops had landed, said the landings were the first of a series. And then later on he said that heavy fighting was taking place in the town of Caen, which is about 10 miles inland. Berlin admits that the invaders have succeeded in sending landing barges into 2 estuaries that are behind the Atlantic Wall, that great line of defenses which Hitler has talked about so much in the last couple of years or so. The Germans admit that Allied tanks have cut their way inland several miles between the towns of Caen and Isigny, 2 French towns about 35 miles apart. And, still according to the enemy, our troops have made penetrations ranging up to 10 miles. Thousands of Allied paratroopers, some reports say at least 20,000, landed behind the enemy lines to disrupt the German supply and communication facilities. These landings were most successful. And the Navy was on hand, too, the biggest armada in anybody's history. Surprisingly, the early reports say, as we just told you, the first resistance was comparatively light. Our casualties have been light so far. Correspondents flying in air squadrons overhead reported our troops splashing ashore against only little resistance. The airborne troops, the soldiers who crossed over the enemy land in air transports and gliders, have encountered only slight resistance so far. But this should not be taken as an indication of things to come. Quite the contrary. While it's true that the going seems to have been fairly easy so far, it'll get tougher later on. The Germans, for instance, are holding huge reserves of troops behind the lines, waiting to see where the Allies will hit the hardest. When that fact is determined, the enemy high command will order everything in his power into the attack. Thus, the job of our paratroopers and airborne forces is to blow up the bridges, the highways, and the railroads over which the enemy reserves would have to move to counter our main blow. This enemy blow may come in a day. It may come next week sometime. But when it does come, it will be the enemy's supreme attempt to knock a damaging hole in our invading armies. And the fighting will be tough. General Eisenhower calls the invasion a crusade, and he says that nothing less than full victory can come of it. Early this morning, just a short while after the first official announcement of the invasion had been made, Eisenhower made a special broadcast to the underground fighters of the occupied countries. He warned them against any premature uprising, but he urged them to complete their preparations and to stand ready for the signal. And that signal, it is expected, will touch off the greatest revolt in history. Estimates place the size of these underground armies at something like 8 million men. 8 million men armed and waiting to strike back at the people who have held them in subjugation for so many years. Well, perhaps it might be a good idea now to take a look at the geography, that is, the land at which the Allied armies are striking today. General Eisenhower's invasion hit the Atlantic Wall in the sector of the lowest French coastline, the widest beaches, avoiding the heavily fortified cliffs opposite Dover, upon which the Germans had planted naval guns which command the narrow Straits of Dover at the eastern entrance to the channel. Caen apparently is the center of the first attack by airborne parachute troops. That's a key point on the water-level roads and railroads to Paris, which is barely 120 miles away, since its capture, that is, the capture of Caen, would force a German evacuation, hastily, of the whole Cherbourg Peninsula. So far as the geography of the French coast is concerned, the Allied High Command picked for its initial attack a sector giving the Allied forces the most favorable terrain. Except for the coastline east of Le Havre toward Dieppe, where there are high, steep cliffs, the whole seafront under attack is flat and sandy. Cherbourg lies at the foot of a cliff with the city and port at water level, but with the fortifications and airfield on a high plateau on the cliff dominating the city from the south. It always was considered one of the best fortified and strongest defended of the French Channel ports. Le Havre lies at the mouth of the Seine, the natural gateway to Paris. The Havre port, once the terminal of the Normandy and many other great transatlantic liners, is the biggest port on the French North Shore. It was under frequent air attack during 4 years of occupation, but unless the Germans dynamite its locks in their defense or retreat, it may be found fairly intact upon the entry of American troops. One of the first coastal villages attacked and flown over by airborne troops was Bure-sur-Mer, the fishing village where Admiral Richard E. Byrd and his crew made a forced landing at the conclusion of their transatlantic flight in June 1927. Prime Minister Churchill told the House of Commons when he went to the address this morning that the invasion was proceeding according to plan. Then, with emphasis, he added, "What a plan." President Roosevelt spent the early mornings of the invasion day writing a prayer for victory for the armed forces, and he will broadcast this prayer to the world at 10 o'clock tonight. He has expressed the hope that the nation will join him in the prayer. In part of that, he says, "Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again, and with thy blessings we shall prevail over the unholy forces of the enemy." Mr. Roosevelt dispatched the prayer to the House by motorcycle messenger, and it was read on the floor shortly after Dr. James Sherrill Montgomery, the chaplain of the House of Representatives, departed from custom to ask members to join him in the opening invocation. Again, the members stood, this time in silent prayer. At its conclusion, Minority Leader Martin of Massachusetts reminded his colleagues that many heartbreaking days lie ahead. During the morning, Mr. Roosevelt summoned the Army and Navy high commands to the White House for his first personal conference with the commanders since troops began hitting the beaches during the night. The high command personnel included General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, General Arnold, head of the Army's Air Forces, and Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations. General Marshall appeared worn when he went to the conference, as though he had spent a sleepless night. Already throughout the nation, countless church services are being held. Many states and cities have issued special proclamations on D-Day. Britain's King George is scheduled to go on the air this afternoon at 3 o'clock with a special Invasion Day message. French General de Gaulle broadcast to the people of France at 11:30 this morning. Before that, King Haakon of Norway sent a special message to his people. And now General Wilhelm Hanstein, Commander-in-Chief of the Norwegian Underground, has broadcast an order to all organized fighting groups inside Norway to be prepared to take part in the great settlement. Well, that's the invasion news as it looks so far. I'll be back in a few minutes with a summary of developments today. And now back to Bernadine Flynn.
Thank you, Alan. That was Alan Jackson, one of Columbia's news editors in New York, bringing us the latest details on the invasion and how it's been going since early this morning. If any later bulletins should come in while we're on the air, we'll bring them right to you. Recently, General Eisenhower prepared the underground of Europe for D-Day. A member of his staff told the downtrodden people to learn to recognize his voice, which was to bring them directions and instructions daily.
And now that voice from Supreme Headquarters has announced to them and to the world that D-Day, H-hour, has arrived.
Yes, Ed, and already the underground is secretly at work disrupting every enemy defense and troop movement possible. They are cutting communications, dynamiting bridges and viaducts, opening dams, destroying power lines and railroads.
And I understand the French underground numbers more than 1 million people.
That's right. It's a force which began as a guerrilla unit, and today it's virtually a corps of sabotage engineers. It's made up of many officers and men of the disbanded French army, men from all walks of life, all creeds and political beliefs. Most of the officers are army men, and many of its fighters have fought the Germans in 2 wars. There are also thousands of boys in the green uniforms of the youth labor camps who have chosen to join the underground rather than to go back to Germany as conscripts.
You know, it's certainly amazing the way members of the underground have been able to feed themselves and gather information so secretly.
Usually they are fed by their friends, and many times they gather food from isolated farms and villages. Planes flying over from London have delivered arms and explosives to them, as well as printing material and other supplies. Coded messages have kept the underground informed as to when these planes fly over.
And every message and instruction to these men has had to be safeguarded with an enormous amount of care. One misunderstood direction could mean disaster. For instance, for many months, our own men have been preparing for this invasion. It's taken weeks and weeks to assemble ships to carry them, planes to support their landings, ammunition and food. but tons of material could be lost through a single careless accident.
How true that is, Ed. While thousands of planes are necessary, it's still more important that one plane with a wide-awake pilot with the right guns and ammunition be in the right spot at the right moment.
Exactly. A misread photograph, a road that must be open but is crowded with refugees, or even an open porthole on a ship are all invasion risks. The shine can be taken off helmets and the metal parts of guns, but there's no way of making sure that one or the other might not strike by chance against a landing boat shield and set off a spark to alert the enemy ashore. These are all things which couldn't be figured out on paper ahead of time, and yet they're things on which the very success of this second front depends.
Ed, let's take our visitors on an imaginary visit over the English countryside where the chief of our invasion forces spent his hours working and planning every detail of this second front.
General Eisenhower lived for a while in London, didn't he?
Yes, he did, but some time ago he moved out to a 6-room cottage in the country. The general was up every morning by 5 or 6 o'clock. Each morning before breakfast, he puttered around the garden for a little while and then read the newspapers. But by 8 o'clock, he'd had his breakfast and was in his office hard at work.
An office completely surrounded with maps and important documents, I should imagine.
Yes, and with many pictures. Pictures of his family and of the Allied leaders of the world. One of the pictures is from President Roosevelt. There is also one from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The inscription is in Chinese. You were speaking of documents, Ed. One of the most important of these is the shortest. It is the President's cable to Stalin informing him of Eisenhower's appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front Invasion Force.
And that room has contained countless secrets which the Germans had sacrificed many divisions to learn.
It is a rectangular room with a big fireplace and 2 small tables and a large walnut desk in a corner between 2 windows. On the wall, there is an enormous map of Europe. In his office, the general has worked 7 days a week on invasion plans. And now, friends, let's switch back to the New York newsroom to see if any late details have come in since we last heard from Alan Jackson.
There have been few really late details on the invasion in the last few minutes. However, here is a brief summary of the way the invasion news looks right now. The British Ministry of Supply says that many secret weapons never before used are being employed by the invading Allied troops. In Washington, Admiral King, commander of the United States Fleet, says that in his viewpoint, the invasion is doing all right so far. General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, says, "I can't make any statement." And to newsmen there, he said, "You know all about it." Allied headquarters in England reveals that the invasion was scheduled for a day earlier, but was postponed because of bad weather. A dispatch from London quotes the German DNB news agency as saying that the invasion front has further widened in the past few hours. Prime Minister Churchill, as you know, has said that heavy fighting is taking place in the town of Caen, about 10 miles inland from the French coast. And that's the invasion news to this minute.
Thank you again, Alan. Well, friends, the liberation of Western Europe is underway. Alan Jackson, one of Columbia's news editors, has supplied us with the latest news on this greatest of all military operations. It can't be repeated too often. The fighting that lies ahead will be extremely bitter. Let's all offer up a prayer for victory.
That, friends, ends another edition of Crisco's Radio Newspaper. Join us again tomorrow at this same time. Until then, this is Ed Roberts
and Bernadine Flynn saying goodbye for the makers of Crisco.
We return you now to New York.
This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. The Goldbergs, presented by the makers of Duz, will not be heard today. interrupt this program. We take you now to CBS Washington. Albert Leach reporting.
Washington has accepted the news of invasion with mixed emotions. The expressions of the man on the street have been remarkably similar to those of representatives in Congress. The dominant note was a prayer for success and expressions of confidence in ultimate victory under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Early this morning, I stopped a Marine corporal in a spar. I asked for their reaction. "Wow," said the Marine, "we'll be home by Christmas." Over in Congress, Senator Edwin C. Johnson said the invasion will prove to be for Germany the Waterloo of World War II. House Democratic leader McCormick made this statement. "Our boys," he said, "are fighting for early victory to preserve for the future a decent world to live in." The final phase, the invasion, is now on. We have had 2 terrible wars in less than 25 years. Let us hope that after victory, the United Nations will have courageous leadership that will save the next generations from war. Republican leader Joseph W. Martin said this: "The Allied armies landing in France carry with them the hopes of liberty-loving people all over the world. That the invading forces shall meet with complete success and win an early and decisive victory is the devout prayer of all our people. An early victory and an early return of the fighting men of America to their homes is our fervent hope." But dawn broke over Washington this morning to find the streets of this world capital virtually deserted. It was a bright, cool morning. There was no outward change in Washington. Radio stations and newspapers were, of course, operating with full staffs, as they had been for several hours. The Pentagon building, where the War Department is housed, the Navy Department, other government offices directly concerned with the war, were operating with nearly complete staffs and with additional employees arriving by the minute. But on the streets and in the downtown buildings of Washington, there was no change. Virtually none of these people seemed to be aware that the invasion had begun. When several were told, they were skeptical. They had seen the error of Saturday, and they had it still in mind. As the morning lengthened, Washington in general still seemed to be concerned only with its early morning business as usual. By 6 o'clock, the number of people on the streets had not increased to any appreciable extent. Invasion or no, Washington is not an early rising town. 8 o'clock is about the earliest starting hour. For 5 minutes just after 6 o'clock, from the newsroom of CBS in Washington, I watched the corner of 13th and E Streets northwest. In that 5 minutes, 2 passenger cars, 1 taxi, 1 bus, and 2 pedestrians passed by. During the day, 13th and E is one of Washington's busiest corners, and it is usually crowded until as late as 1:30 in the morning. Crowded with all the color that makes up wartime Washington. For this corner is in the heart of the theatrical restaurant district. During the morning and throughout the evening hours, servicemen and servicewomen in all the uniforms of the United Nations mingle with the thousands in civilian dress. But by 7 a.m., business had picked up a little, but still no more than normal. Laundry trucks were in evidence, and so were the ice trucks servicing the restaurants. And most of the pedestrians were solitary, walking along at leisurely pace. There was no excited greeting, no manifestations whatsoever that the long-awaited invasion was underway. It was not until 7:30, when the 8 o'clock starters began to hurry along, that an undercurrent of excitement was evident.